So this morning, I want to start with a monologue. This is concerning the current immigration debate that I personally think is going to turn into a civil war, folks, because the U.S. government it doesn't matter if it's Republican or Democrat, they are out of touch with the public. They are tone deaf. They view immigration as a political tool for their own agendas. And I personally believe that this immigration debate, this immigration war, is as a result of a huge bloodstain in American history. So I'm going to read a monologue that I typed up this morning, and then I'm going to go to some articles. In May 1939, 3 ships carrying Jewish refugees who were fleeing religious persecution by a Christian country, namely Germany, set sail to the Americas. Each and every Jew had their legal paperwork in hand and requested asylum to other Christian nations in the Americas. Cuba took in only a handful and then shut the immigration door. These refugees then put a call in to the President of the United States, a Christian. Unlike the illegal immigrants and dreamers today, these Jewish refugees were prepared to stay on the ships in Cuba until they were issued visas. In other words, they were prepared to stand in line legally, just like everyone else, and did not demand special treatment at all. What did the Christian American government do to their Jewish brethren? Did they bother to read Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46? Obviously not. Instead, they accused the innocent Jews of being Nazi spies as an excuse not to let them in. Once again, they accused the innocent Jews of being Nazi spies as an excuse not to let them in. This alone is proof that while both Republican and Democrat politicians today, probably for the sake of the drug trade, will always and forever allow illegal immigrants to cross the southern border, but would never allow a single persecuted Jew to enter legally. The U.S. government is now cursed, along with its blood-stained European Christian brethren, for what they did in 1939. Because of what is written in Genesis 12 and verse 3 and Numbers 24 and verse 9, if you care to read it. There are not enough words in the English language to describe how I feel about the past and current hypocrisy of the American immigration system. Okay, now we're going to go to screen share. What did I just do? Oh no, okay. All right, so we're going to go to United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. See, United States government has evidence against itself. It's in the Holocaust Museum. In May, this is at encyclopedia.us. ushmm.org, the Holocaust Encyclopedia. In May 1939, several ships, including the passenger liner St. Louis, brought Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany, including recently annexed Austria, Bohemia, and Moravia, to Havana, Cuba. 3 such ships carrying refugees seeking harbor were the Orduña, the Flandre, and the Orinoco. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. These ships arrived in the Havana harbor, but not all their passengers were allowed to disembark. On the Orduña, in May 27, 1939, the day that also saw the arrival of the St. Louis, the British Pacific Steamship Navigation Company's Orduña landed at the harbor in Havana carrying 120 Austrian, Czech, and German Jews. The Cuban authorities permitted 48 passengers, all of whom held landing permits, to enter Cuba, but refused to allow the remaining 72 passengers to disembark. The Orduña set off again on May 29th, bound for South America, but with no assurance that the passengers would be allowed to land in any harbor. 2 days later, the passengers appealed to President Franklin D. Roosevelt in a radiogram for U.S. assistance, noting that 67 of the 72 remaining refugees held affidavits or registration numbers for immigration into the United States and had intended to wait in Cuba for their entry visas to be issued. For weeks, the Orduña sought a safe harbor that would accept the refugees. After traveling through the Panama Canal, the ship made brief stops at ports in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. While in Ecuador, a joint distribution committee representative arranged refuge for 4, just 4, of the 72 Jews. At the same time, the Orduña's captain made contact with Rabbi Nathan Whitkin Jr., a representative of the U.S.-based Jewish Welfare Board stationed in the U.S.-controlled Canal Zone. While the support of the British Pacific Steamship Navigation Company and the JDC, with the support, Whitkin arranged for the remaining 68 refugees to be transferred in Lima, Peru, to the British Orbita, which was en route to Europe via the Panama Canal. Whitkin then persuaded U.S. authorities in the Canal Zone to permit the Orbita's refugee passengers to disembark in Balboa, a town near the Pacific end of the zone. Once in Balboa, 7 Jewish refugees obtained Chilean entry visas and departed for Chile. The remaining 55 stayed in Balboa at Fort Amador, the location of the Canal Zone quarantine station, until the end of September 1940. With the assistance of the JDC and the New York-based Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, Rabbi Whitkin arranged a transfer to the United States of the 55 refugees and 79 additional refugees who had arrived at Fort Amador since May 1939 on the U.S. transport ship American Legion. The success in finding refuge in the United States for Orduña's passengers was not matched for the other Jewish refugees arriving in Havana Harbor in 1939. At the end of May 1939, the French line's Flandre brought 104 German, Austrian, and Czech Jewish passengers to Havana. As in the case of the St. Louis and the Orduña, Cuban officials would not permit the Flanders passengers to disembark, and the ship set sail for Mexico. During the second week of June, the Flandre sought permission for its refugee passengers to disembark at several Mexican ports without success. After a short time, the Jews aboard the Flandre were forced to return to France, where they were subsequently admitted but interned by the French government. You know, the Vichy French government. Similarly, on May 29, in the Orinoco, the St. Louis sister ship left Hamburg with 200 passengers bound for Cuba. Informed by radio of the difficulties in Havana, the captain of the Orinoco diverted the ship to waters just off of Cherbourg, France, where it remained for days. The Cuban treatment of the St. Louis refugees, and to a lesser extent of those aboard the Flandre and the Orduña, had focused international scrutiny on Cuba's immigration procedures. Nevertheless, neither the British government nor the French government was prepared to accept Orinocho's refugees. The United States government then intervened, but only half-heartedly. U.S. authorities did not accept the refugees either. Though U.S. diplomats in London pressured the German ambassador to give assurances that the German authorities would not persecute the Orinocho refugees upon their return to the German Reich. With this dubious assurance, the 200 refugees returned to Germany in June 1939. Their fates remains unknown. Yes, they had their paperwork, folks. They did not plan on coming illegally. And I had erased, or I had deleted some things about, let's see, FBI falsely accused. Let me see if I can find that. All right, I think this might be the right one. This is on the Smithsonian.com, folks. The U.S. government turned away thousands of Jewish refugees fearing that they were Nazi. They knew they weren't Nazi spies, folks. No, folks. You can tell that Christians don't read Romans 11. How? By the way they act toward the Jews. In a long tradition of persecuting the refugee, the State Department and FDR claimed that the Jewish immigrants could threaten national security. By Daniel Gross. This is the St. Louis. These are the Jews aboard the St. Louis, coming with their paperwork, ready to stand in line, didn't illegally cross the border. Going back home would mean their death because of religion. In the summer of 1942, the SS Drottningholm set sail carrying hundreds of desperate Jewish refugees en route to New York City from Sweden. Among them was Herbert Karl Friedrich Bahr. That's right, Bahr. That's a familiar Jewish name, isn't it? Yeah, they treated him much like they're treating Roseanne Barr today. But anyway, I digress. A 28-year-old from Germany who also was seeking entry to the United States. When he arrived, he told the same story as his fellow passengers. As a victim of persecution, he wanted asylum from Nazi violence. But during a meticulous interview process that involved 5 separate government agencies, Bahr's story began to unravel. Really? Days later, the FBI accused Bahr of being a Nazi spy. They said the Gestapo had given him $7,000 to steal American industrial secrets, and that he'd pose as a refugee in order to sneak into the country unnoticed. False accusations coming from the U.S. government, a Christian nation. His case was rushed to trial, and the prosecution called for the death penalty. No different than the Nazis. What Barr didn't know, or perhaps didn't mind, was that the story would be used as an excuse to deny visas to thousands of Jews fleeing the horrors of the Nazi regime. World War II prompted the largest displacement of human beings the world had ever seen. Although today's refugee crisis is starting to approach its unprecedented scale. But even with millions of European Jews displaced from their homes, the United States had a poor track record offering asylum. Most notoriously, in June 1939, the German ocean liner St. Louis and its 939 passengers, almost all Jewish, were turned away from the port of Miami, forcing the ship to return to Europe. More than a quarter died in the Holocaust. So what that means is the United States government owns responsibility for the deaths, was a co-conspirator with Nazi Germany in the deaths of these Jews. Government officials, from the State Department to the FBI to President Franklin Roosevelt himself, argued that refugees pose a serious threat to national security. Yet today, historians believe that Barr's case was practically unique, and the concern about refugee spies was blown far out of proportion. You think? In the court of public opinion, the story of a spy disguised as a refugee was too scandalous to resist. America's was months into the largest war the world had ever seen, and in February 1942, Roosevelt had ordered the internment of tens of thousands of Japanese Americans. Every day the headlines announced new Nazi conquests. Barr was scholarly and broad-shouldered, a man Newsweek called the latest fish in the spy net. Yes, even the American media participated in this slander of the Jews. Barr was definitely not a refugee. He had been born in Germany, but emigrated to the United States in his teens and became a naturalized citizen. He returned to Germany in 1938 as an engineer exchange student in Hanover, where he was contacted by the Gestapo. At his preliminary hearing, the Associated Press reported that Barr was nattily clad in gray and smiling pleasantly. By the time his trial began, he had little reason to smile. In a hefty 37-page statement, he admitted to attending spy school in Germany. His defense was that he had planned to reveal everything to the U.S. government. But you see, folks, this is how they did this man. What if he was telling the truth? But then he said he'd stalled because he was afraid. Everywhere, no matter where, there are German agents, he claimed. That was true. Comments like these only fed widespread fear of a supposed fifth column of spies and saboteurs that had infiltrated America. U.S. Attorney General Francis Biddle said in 1942 that every precaution must be taken to prevent enemy agents slipping across our borders. We already have had experience with them, and we know them to be well-trained and clever. The FBI, meanwhile, released propaganda films that bragged about German spies who had been caught. "We have guarded the secrets given the Army and Navy at striking force in the field," one film said. These suspicions were not only directed at ethnic Germans, all foreigners became suspect. "Jews were not considered immune," said Richard Brightman, a scholar of Jewish history. The American ambassador to France, William Bullitt, made the unsubstantiated statement that France fell in 1940 partly because of a vast network of spying refugees. More than one half of the spies captured doing actual military spy work against the French army were refugees from Germany, he said. "Do you believe that there are no Nazi and communist agents of this sort in America?" "These kinds of anxieties were not new," said Philip Orchard, a historian of international refugee policy. "When religious persecution in the 17th century led to the flight of thousands of French Huguenots, the first group ever referred to as refugees, European nations worried that accepting them would lead to war with France. Later, the asylum seekers themselves became objects of suspicion. With the rise of anarchism at the turn of the 20th century, where there are unfounded fears that anarchists would pose as refugees to enter countries to engage in violence," Orchard said. These suspicions seeped into American immigration policy. In late 1938, American consulates were flooded with 125,000 applicants for visas, many coming from Germany, the annexed territories of Austria. But the national quotas for Germany and Austrian immigrants had been set firmly at 27,000. Immigration restrictions actually tightened as the refugee crisis worsened. Wartime measures demanded a special scrutiny of anyone with relatives in Nazi territories, even relatives in concentration camps. Well, that was sure a poor excuse for judgment, wasn't it? Which proved that he didn't give a damn about the Jews. Period. At a press conference, President Roosevelt repeated the unproven claims from his advisors that some Jewish refugees had been coerced to spy for the Nazis. "Not all of them are voluntary spies," Roosevelt said. "It's a rather horrible story, but in some of the other countries that refugees out of Germany had gone to, especially Jewish refugees, they found a number of definitely proven spies. Here and there, skeptics objected. As the historian Deborah Lipstadt points out in her book Beyond Belief, the New Republic portrayed the government's attitude as persecuting the refugee, and she was right. The nation didn't believe that the State Department could cite a single instance of forced espionage, but these voices were drowned out in the name of national security. America's policies created a striking dissonance from the news from Nazi Germany. In the Australian newspaper The Advertiser, above an update on Barr's trial, a feature story put the refugee crisis in chilling context. About 50,000 Jews from the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia and from Berlin, Hamburg, and Westphalia had been dumped by the Nazi at Terezin until the end of 1944, by which time photographs and newspapers reports had demonstrated that the Nazis were carrying out mass murder. Attorney General Francis Biddle warned Roosevelt not to grant immigrant status to refugees. Barr appeared weak as he finished his testimony in August 1942. At the defense table, he collapsed for a few minutes with his head in his hands. On August 26th, the jury reached a verdict. Barr was guilty of conspiracy and planned espionage, a conviction that could warrant the death penalty. The next day, Barr's birthday, his wife announced she planned to divorce him. The case of Herbert Karl Friedrich Barr fascinated the public for months, and with good reason. It showed readers a very real case of attempted spying carried out with an utter disregard of its impact on innocent refugees. The question was, what Americans should do with this knowledge? Government agencies like the State Department use spy trials as fuel for the argument against accepting refugees. But late in the war, government whistleblowers began to question this approach. In 1944, the Treasury Department released a damning report. Initialed by lawyer Francis Paul, it read, "I am convinced on the basis of the information which is available to me that certain officials in our State Department, which is charged with carrying out this policy, have been guilty not only of gross procrastination, but of willful failure to act, but even of willful attempts to prevent action from being taken to rescue Jews from Hitler." In an interview, Lipstadt said that the State Department's attitude was shaped by wartime paranoia and downright bigotry. All those things, they feed into this fear of the foreigner, she said. It was thanks to the Treasury Department's report that Roosevelt formed a new body, the War Refugee Board, that belatedly, too late, in other words, accepted tens of thousands of Jewish refugees. But by that time, millions of Jews had already died in Europe. Barr lived to tell his tale. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. It's not clear whether he lived long enough to be released, but in 1946, after the war ended, he did make headlines again. The FBI called him to stand at the trial of another accused spy. Once more, he told a rapt audience about spy tricks he learned from the Gestapo. Then he was sent back to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. With the politicians in the U.S. and Europe again calling for refugee bans in the name of national security, it is easy to see the parallels with the history of World War II. Lipstadt and Orchard think that although today's refugee crisis isn't identical to mass migration in World War II, the past could still offer lessons for the future. They say that this time around, the governments should be careful not to rush quickly into new policies. Simplistic kinds of answers, close all doors to refugees or welcome everyone, are dangerous and ultimately counterproductive, says Lipstadt. Now, folks, please listen to that very carefully concerning this so-called refugee crisis we have today. As Lipstadt put it, simplistic kinds of answers, close all the doors to refugees or welcome everyone, are dangerous and ultimately counterproductive. I think I can stop right here. So what I'm getting at is, how is it? And I often talk about Democrats and Republicans alike. But in this case, a Democrat president, 1939, who, to make sure that the Jews couldn't come in, would falsely accuse them of working for the Germans. As spies, so they would not have to let him in. Yet today, we have the Democrat Party who want to open the borders and let everyone in the southern border. And this thing is so transparent. It's not like, this is not like what was happening in 1939 and 1940. Not anything close. This is about the drug trade. And I tell you, The politicians themselves, how do they get so rich? How do they get so rich when they enter into the federal government system, not millionaires at all? And when they leave, multi-millionaires and sometimes even multi-billionaires, just in a matter of 8 years. How does this happen? Drugs coming in through the southern border, killing hundreds of thousands of Americans every year, including Jewish Americans. And it seems like that one and perhaps both parties, both political parties, I suspect, based upon what I am seeing, are against a normal, pragmatic immigration system where people have to stand in line for their paperwork to be processed and their voice to be heard. Well, they wouldn't even hear the voices of the Jews who were clearly persecuted and marked for destruction by the Nazis in the 1930s and the 1940s. They didn't want to listen to that. And yet, they will accept some of the worst drug trafficking that the world has ever seen through the United States, subjecting the destruction of their own citizens as a result. How does it? I tell you, it's all about the money, folks. It's all about the money. It really, really is. I know that, what was it? FDR, he made, I don't know if I can find this, but I'll try. Maybe this will pull it up. I don't know. All right. Let's see here. Let me copy this just in case. All right. And this is unfortunately typical of Christians today. Arrogance against the Jews. You do not judge a man by what he says. You have to judge him by what he does. This particular article, and I just pulled this up, folks. All I did was just pull it up. I didn't prepare for this. By Christine Wicker, Lessons to be Learned, The Faith of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The importance of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Christian faith has been so rarely examined that many people don't know he was religious at all. But his words, his political accomplishments, and the testimony of those who knew him well shows that his political vision reflected the highest ideals embraced by Jesus. He had been taught from early childhood that Christians were meant to be instruments of God's will. So I wonder if he thought he should impose his version of God's will upon the Jews in 1939. I will continue. Having said that, so what? We know what he did. Does it matter why he did it? In writing The Simple Faith of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I asked myself those questions every day. I looked for spiritual understanding that I could use myself, and at the same time, guidance that might help those who despair in our current political situation. I found both. Knowing what motivates FDR tells us who Americans once were. It's a benchmark that helps us understand the kind of people we've become today. She says, FDR's Episcopalian faith taught him what was good and what was evil. Yeah, I bet it did. It gave him language to laud good and condemn evil. Why then didn't he do what was right and condemn evil? It focused him on making life better for average Americans. It gave him the imagination to envision America, a place being so filled with brotherhood that it sounds more like God's kingdom on earth than real United States. So typical of Christians. They do not understand that Jehovah's kingdom is going to be in Jerusalem, Israel. He begins to describe that the world we see that while like the world Jesus wanted, the world Jesus wanted? Well, I don't know who this Jesus is, but Yehoshua said, love not the world, nor the things that are in the world. This one does not come about from a bit of tweaking. Roosevelt believed Americans could be and were being spiritually transformed. What, by rejecting the Jews? He believed that they were embracing a radical new understanding of how life ought to be lived. How? By blocking the door to the Jews, ensuring their death? This new understanding undermines the old admiration of worldly success as such, he said. We are beginning to abandon our tolerance for the abuse of power by those who betray for profit the elementary decency of life. In this process, evil things formerly accepted will not be so easily condoned. Hard-headedness will not so easily excuse hard-heartedness. Okay, Mr. Roosevelt, why the hardness of your heart in 1939? You see, well, I'll continue. I'm going to see how far I should go with this. I know this is eventually talking about Donald Trump. I understand that. To understand how far America's public understanding of Christianity has fallen compared to FDR's vision with that of Donald Trump, whose Christian followers are proclaiming him to be the elect of God. Really? Really? Trump and his followers think Americans, the most blessed humans in history, are being asked to do much for others and need to do more for themselves. Now, apparently, they're trying to liken, I'll read some more of this lack of Jesus-like Christian voices in the American public square has been disastrous for not only the poor and huddled masses, but for all the earth. The world's most powerful country, a beacon of brotherhood and justice for more than 250 years. Yes, brotherhood and justice, including the war between the states, which cost hundreds of thousands of lives. I will continue. Has elected the most powerful leader on earth and utterly amoral man intent on dismantling an international system of brotherhood that has kept us from world war during the last 72 years and spread prosperity beyond the wildest imaginings of the American founders. An important part of FDR's faith story is how fervently many Americans this day embrace his non-sectarian, deeply religious ideas. Businessmen who oppose him launched a well-financed campaign to disempower his Sermon on the Mount spirituality even before he took office. Their first efforts focused on arousing Americans' own self-interest, but FDR's influence was so great they couldn't get citizens to disavow their sense of being joined with one another. By now, you can see that this is obviously a Democrat pro-FDR spiel. Let's be honest, folks. This book of Donald Trump called The Art of the Deal, it talked about a negotiating process that you have to start high, extremely high. So high, in fact, when you begin your negotiation, that your intention is actually to go to meet halfway. That particular line was your goal. So I read a report somewhere, I have to look at it, that during the Obama administration, that the Republicans in Congress wanted to start with $40 billion for a wall and border protection and so on and so forth, and would accept the dreamers, as they say. And this is where they were going to start with. Well, Donald Trump, he wanted to start with $5.7 billion. And before the negotiating even started, he's talking about giving 3 more years to the DACA program. This is not the negotiation tactic he talked about in his book, The Art of the Deal. This is more like the Democrat version. Now, what am I getting at here? What I'm getting at here, see, I'm not participating in this current immigration argument. What I'm pointing out here is the hypocrisy of the American immigration system against the Jews. Okay? This is one more reason why I'm wearing the yellow star. To testify against all Christianity of the arrogance that they harbor against the Jews, the brethren. They're brethren, the Jews. The hatred that when push comes to shove, Every single time, or nearly every single time, they will throw the Jew under the bus in favor of themselves. Well, as I pointed out before, and I keep using, maybe I should use another person, but I keep going back to Irene Gut. I keep going back to her. Why? Because she threw herself under the bus for the Jews. Irene Gut Opdyke, born Irene Gut, was a Polish nurse, of course, who gained international recognition for aiding Polish Jews persecuted by Nazi Germany during World War II. She was honored as righteous among nations by Yad Vashem for seeking her own life, or for risking her own life to save 12 Jews from certain death. 12 Jews. Interesting, huh? She was a Catholic. Irene Gut was born into a Catholic family with 5 daughters in Kozanich, Poland. During the interwar period, the family moved to Radom, which she enrolled at nursing school before the Nazi-Soviet invasion in 1939. At the age of 20, Irene witnessed a German soldier kill an infant in 1942. This event transformed her life. During the German occupation, Gut was hired by the Wehrmacht Major Eduard Rugemer to work in a kitchen of a hotel which frequently served Nazi officials. Inspired by her religious faith, well, that's interesting. I wondered why many of the other Christians didn't have her religious faith. She would secretly take food from the hotel and deliver it to the Tarnopol ghetto. All right, well, hold on. Let's go to Matthew 25, right? Now, I want to show you something here. When we read Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46, I'm going to ask you a question. Is the name Jesus written anywhere? Can you see it in this particular passage? No, you can't, because it's not there. Why? What am I pointing out? Well, Christians over and over and over, they say that you have to believe in the name of Jesus in order to be saved. Well, this entire passage disproves that altogether. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, we just read about Irene Gut secretly bringing in food to the ghetto, to the Tarnopol ghetto right here. Gut smuggled Jews out of the ghetto into the surrounding forest and delivered food for them there as well. So let's go to Matthew 25, shall we? When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, when he shall sit upon his throne of glory. Where? Well, if you read, when he told the apostles, they asked him, well, we've given up everything. What is going to be our reward? He said, in the rebirth, in the regeneration. No, you cannot be reborn until Israel is reborn. In the rebirth, when the Son of Man sits on his throne of glory, and the 12 apostles are going to be judging the 12 tribes of Israel. In other words, in the rebirth and the regeneration, all 12 tribes of Israel are going to be back in the Holy Land with the 12 apostles judging them. What's going to happen then? Then, and before him shall be gathered all the Gentiles. This is exactly what it means. Ethnos. Look it up in Strong's Concordance. You will see that it is all the nations apart from Israel. And then he shall separate these Gentiles, one from another, as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. And he shall set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on his left. Remember how this person was lauding and glorifying President FDR's Christian values, yet he slammed the door shut on the Jews. Then the king shall say unto them on his right hand, Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Why? Because you believed in the name of Jesus? That's not what it says, does it? It says, For I was hungry and you gave me meat. What did Irene Good do? She smuggled Jews out of the ghetto into the surrounding forest and delivered food for them there as well. Okay. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you took me in. Naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came unto me. Then shall the righteous say, When, Master, did we see you hungry and fed you? What are you talking about? Or thirsty and gave you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and took you in, or naked and you clothed you? Or when saw we you sick or in prison and came unto you? And the king shall answer and say unto them, Because inasmuch as you have, now these are Gentiles he's talking to. And so when he says, one of the least of these my brethren, by default, he's talking about the Jews. If all the Gentiles are accounted for in this gathering of all the Gentiles in front of him to be separated, the sheep from the goats, then the least of his brethren are the Jews. Plain and simple, folks. Done it to one. Just one. Look how gracious and merciful the Messiah is to the Gentiles who've done this, given food to just one of the least, not the greatest, the least, the most despised of these my brethren. You have done it unto me. Okay? But she didn't do that to one. No, 12, one for each of the tribes of Israel. She did. Rugemer asked Gut to work as a housekeeper in his requisitioned villa. She hid the 12 Jews in the cellar. They would come out and help her clean the house when he was not around. These horrible Nazi spies that FDR and the FBI accused them of being, even helped Irene Good clean the house of this Nazi. One day, Rugemer found out about the Jews she was hiding at personal risk to all their lives. Rugemer kept Gut's secret, and in return, she became his whore. Oh, I'm sorry, mistress. What's the difference? She threw herself under the bus. She sacrificed her own dignity. To do the right thing. Rugemer fled with the Germans in 1944 ahead of the German advance. She and several Jews also fled west from Soviet-occupied Poland and the Allied-occupied Germany. She was put in the displaced persons camp where she met William Opdyke a United Nations worker from New York City. She emigrated to the United States and married William Opdyke. Thereafter, they raised a family together. After years of silence, she didn't say a word about it. Regarding her wartime experience in 1975, this story right here is not quite accurate. She let part of the story spill out by accident. She was going to keep it a secret forever. Opdyke was convinced to speak after hearing a neo-Nazi claim that actually this was the reason why she accidentally told her story. Well, it slipped out because she was going to keep it a secret because she believed that you're supposed to keep your good works away from the public eye, as the Messiah said to do. She was convinced to speak after hearing a neo-Nazi claim that the Holocaust never occurred. Feeling compelled to share her story, Opdyke began a public speaking career, which culminated her memoir, In My Hands, Memoirs of a Holocaust Rescuer. 1982, Opdyke, Gut, was recognized and honored by Yad Vashem, that is, the Jewish World Holocaust Memorial Remembrance Center, as one of the Polish righteous among the nations. Okay. So, while world leaders proclaim their Christianity, there was a little girl who actually did the right thing and did not shut the door of her heart, even if it costed her her own dignity. So I would be remiss if I did not finish Matthew 25. Verse 41, then he shall say unto them on his left hand, depart from me, you cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. It doesn't matter if they claim that they're Christian or not. For I was hungry and you gave me no meat. Yeah, you shut the door. You slammed the door in his face. I was thirsty and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger and you... Uh-oh. What? What is this? Verse 43, I was a stranger and you took me not in. Mr. Roosevelt, the FBI, the government of the United States, that's you. In the darkest hour of the Jews, in 1939, Yehoshua, the Messiah, was a stranger and you didn't take him in. Naked and you clothed me not, sick and in prison and you visited me not. Then shall they also answer him and saying, Master, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not minister unto you? And he shall answer them saying, verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you did it not to one of the least of these, the Jews, you did it not unto me. And these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into life eternal. Now, Franklin Roosevelt died before the freeing of the Jews in the concentration camps. This blessing here in verses 34 through 40 also applies to the soldiers who opened up the concentration camps to set them free, for the nurses that were with them and the doctors who took care of them, some of them unsuccessfully. But they also are in this particular group right here. But the US government under Franklin Delano Roosevelt is this section. How is the US government then going to fare in the coming judgment? It would have been wise for President Donald Trump to point out this grievous crime in the history of the United States. It would have been right for him to point out that the Jews, that the Democrats rejected, planned to wait in line, planned to immigrate legally. That was the plan. He could have done this. Why didn't he? It's the same Christian arrogance. It just doesn't stop, folks. It just doesn't stop. There should be a day of mourning. There should be a day of memorial for these people, for those Jews who were turned away. The United States should never forget this crime against the Messiah that the American government has done. It should be a marker of how to immigrate properly into the United States. But no. But no. Not going to do that. And because of this, my personal opinion, of course, my opinion is just like everybody else's. It's worth what it costs you, and it doesn't cost you a dime. The crime against the Jews of refusing to take them in when they were a stranger is going to come back and bite the United States extremely, extremely hard through its immigration system. I believe they call that poetic justice. I believe that the United States as a whole is going to come apart as a result of its broken immigration system because of what they did to the Jews in 1939 and 1940. But that's just my opinion. Once again, my opinion is worth as much as it costs you. But at the same time, it is my opinion nevertheless, and it would be a worthy opinion to bear in mind. Anyway, I hope this video was helpful to you today. And please, folks, never ever forget the crimes that were committed against the Jews. And pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Pray that all Israel, both far and near, great and small, great and small in stature, and great and small in percentage, be granted the right to enter the door of immigration into the New Jerusalem.